I have with me here, the incredible, amazing David Bowles, Associate Professor at UT Rio Grande Valley, and also award-winning author across all genres, across all reading groups. Wow, welcome, David.
Thanks. It's great to be talking with you. I've been hoping to for the longest time, like be on a panel with you or just something, and so the chance to chat is just a big pleasure for me.
So, okay, I want to hear, as our listeners do, how this journey, man. I mean, from the Valley to this incredible life committed to creating Latinx fiction. And I know you were also, a school teacher, you're now a professor, but this is not very common.
No, you're right. It's not. I think it's even less common for the few of us from the Valley who do break in and make that our life's work to stay in the Valley. It's really hard because the way publishing and that entire world is set up, it draws you away from the Valley often to other places. And I no hard feelings on my friends who are from the Valley who now live elsewhere, who are pursuing their writing careers. But for me, it really got started when I was a kid. I grew up in a household. One side of the family was white, one side of the family is Mexican American, but I spent almost all my time with the Mexican American side of the family. There's just one cousin on the white side that I didn't really get along with at all. And so growing up in that milieu, so many storytellers. The main one was my grandmother Garza, who just had us spellbound all the time. We were mostly boys, and she could just sit us down and get us to calm down and have us enwrapped for hours, telling us all kinds of scary stories. Including like the traditional fodder of the borderlands, La Llorona, Las Lechuzas, La Mano Pachona, just all these great spooky stories. And it was that really, I think, that instilled in me this desire to do what she could do, because I was a precocious little kid. I was like the youngest of my cousins, and just kind of looking around and understanding that she could perform magic. Like, she was telling these stories that were old when she was a little girl, but she could convey them in a way that just caught us up and made us not want her to ever stop. And I wanted to know more. I wanted to learn other things about the stories. I wanted to go beyond the ends of the stories, and I was always asking questions. And she got really kind of frustrated with me, and she was like, "Look, Mijo, if you want to know more, if you want to have more stories, if you want to know the answers to these questions, you need to learn to read." I was like 4 years old, and that was when I started bugging my mom to teach me to read. And I learned to read before I got into kindergarten. I ended up like dropping out of kindergarten because in 1975, kindergarten wasn't what it is now. There wasn't a huge emphasis on literacy the way it is now. But when I came back to school in first grade, I was reading like at a third grade level, and just like progressively, every year I was just reading at a higher and higher grade level, and it was something kind of unusual. My dad was a reader as well. He was into like pulp magazines and historietas from Mexico and stuff like that. He was really more into like comics, graphica, but he also liked the pulpy short stories, and so he began to share, as he saw my interest in that kind of stuff rising. He began to share all this science fiction, fantasy, and horror golden age stuff that was just like blew my mind, and a lot of that kind of shaped my aesthetic sense. But then I got to middle school, and I had this really great teacher in McAllen, Texas, at the Lincoln Junior High where I went, and who kind of pulled the lid off of poetry for me and got me excited about poetry as well. Especially when I realized that as like a poor, half white, half Mexican American kid in the Valley, I didn't have a whole lot to offer young women. But if I could write a poem, it was like I could open a door. So it was just like this tool also for like social connection. It's really hard when you're like a nerdy bookworm who has all kinds of weird identity crises to fit in, and I found my voice in literature. And as I got older, the poetry dragged me into reading the literary canon and deciding, that I wanted to be a writer, and I wanted to be an English major and study at the university. But during all of that, I mean, aside from the historietas that we would buy in like Reynosa and Progreso, there wasn't a whole lot of like a sense that Latinx people were creating literature. And it wasn't until I got to college at Pan American University, which is now UTRGV, that I got exposed to that and realized that I could like tap into my own heritage in creating the things that I wanted to create. I didn't have to just ape what existed already. I could retool it.
Yeah, so important. And we're going to kind of return to that in just a second. Let me ask you, the collective that you co-created, your work itself, how do you, speaking of Latinx, lack thereof in terms of representation, there's so much to talk to about this, but how do you see your work intervening? And it could be culturally, creatively, politically, on any level. How do you see it intervening?
Well, I mean, I think my work intervenes on all those levels. I think that I deliberately set out initially to just try to be filling in those gaps in the stacks. Right? We know specific numbers about literature for children and teens, but we can kind of extrapolate that out. And like roughly speaking, there are somewhere around, on average, 10,000 books being published and traditionally every year in the United States, and under 500 of those are being written by Latinx, and the number is usually somewhere around 300. There is like this like dearth of representation, and there are all these barriers, all these gatekeepers that stop those stories from getting through, and that have for generations, so that the system itself is set up only to allow voices that resonate in the echo chamber of upper middle class white people from the East Coast mainly. I mean, it's not exclusively that, but that's the voice that's kind of become the norm in literature in the United States, which obviously erases other voices and erases other identities, not just for people like us, Latinx people who are like, never see ourselves in the books, but also for other people reading literature published in the United States. Our absence in that literature, which is like fundamental for intellectual and entertainment life, it does something to people's understanding of the supposedly pluralistic society we live in. I think especially does stuff to kids, and I think that the racist, the systemic racism that exists in this country that like we've been fighting against in recent months really, really strongly with Black Lives Matter demonstrations and so forth, is partly, there are the racists are responsible and the white supremacists are responsible, but also there are all these other systems that benefit from it and do nothing to stop it, and publishing is one of those. So, as a writer trying to create work that centers Latinx identity, specifically Mexican American border identity, and its roots in Mexico, and Mexico's roots in pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. That's really important as a creator, but also as an advocate and a teacher, trying to fight against the systems and push for literary dignity. Because 40 years ago, we had some really important research come out, and people like Walter Dean Myers and his son Christopher, with their really groundbreaking essay in the mid 80s, like laid out the problem very clearly for publishing, but publishing has done very little to address the problem. And I just think that publishing won't until it's being pushed very, very hard from multiple angles, from activists throughout communities across the country, internally from editors and other people of color and their allies within those publishing houses, from the Congress, like what's happening right now with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus as led by Joaquin Castro, and all these other pressures from different organizations, and together we can affect change. And what we did, you can see here, Miriam and Roberto, my fellow, my co-conspirators. Some people have called us terrorists. I don't know. It's kind of really sad. We brought Macmillan to the table, and had them sit down with the three of us and a representative from Presente.org, Matt Nelson, and made them answer to 4 Mexican Americans for what they were doing with American Dirt, and then more broadly with representation. And so those all those things are super important to me. We, our community needs a voice. It needs champions. It needs champions who will open the doors and then stand there as ushers so that other people can come through and reach down and pull people up. And so all of that is part and parcel of what I hope to accomplish.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, because it's boots on the street. It's, all of this very deep focused time, with your computer, with your, say, typewriter, to actually make these transformative fictional spaces that speak and resonate with us on these really deep planetary ancestral levels that you're talking about. Yeah. And then of course the classroom. So on all these levels, let me ask you, as we kind of move through our conversation, I just love your stuff, your reconstructions of the chupacabra and all of the kind of borderlands stuff that we don't see out there. Can you tell us about kind of reclaiming the mythos, the Latinx kind of deep planetary mythos, and how monsters fit in with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is something really special about this, especially Mexican American monster stories that we hear when we're children. I remember there was a year that I was a teacher here in Donna at a charter school, and we were reading some kind of something scary, and it was a group of either 8th or 9th graders, and had parents come in and express their concerns to the principal about the scary things. And these parents were white parents of a white student. And I tried to be comprehensive and walk them through what I was doing, whatever. But at the back of my mind, I was like, man, if literally no Mexican American parent is coming to complain, because we're raised on scary stuff from the time we're born. I still remember the very first lullaby I was sung was "Duérmete mi niño, duérmete ya, porque viene el cucu y te comerá." So you're being told from the get-go, hey, you need to follow the family rules and advice, because there are dangers out there. There are monsters, and they will devour you. And there's something symbolic about that. I think that I see it on one level as representative of the oppressions and collective traumas that the Latinx community has gone through because of colonialization and things like that, and different types of oppression and repression since, for the past 500 years. These stories kind of encode that to some degree. And so taking those stories that I was told by my grandmother Garza, by my father, by my tios and tias and primos and so forth, and that have just reverberate throughout the community, and retooling them using the resources, the tropes, the tools of various different modern genres, is a way of just taking that collective work further into the future and spreading it for a larger audience. The chupacabras itself is kind of like a hybrid evolution of creatures and stories that go back hundreds of years, and that one in particular just seems really ripe for exploration in lots of different ways, as metaphors and so forth for different important conditions. And just in general, I mean, a lot of my early work had to do with taking legends and folktales and retelling them as literary short stories. It was kind of the early work that I would do with students at middle school, when I was a middle school teacher, a 7th grade teacher, was to show them that their lives and their stories and their culture and their language had literary value. And so, I equipped them with these ethnographic techniques for going into the field and recording people and their family telling these stories, and then writing them themselves, adding the character names and background and details about particular geography and temporal locations, and just crafting story out of the raw materials of our collective heritage, which is, you know, just kind of blithely accepted from like the white European tradition. Like everybody, you know, no one blinks an eye at somebody writing a story about some Norse god or Greek god or you know, what have you. But you start bringing in these elements from Mexico, and suddenly it's like, ooh, really exotic, weird. And what I want to do is normalize it and make it badass.
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
talked to John Picasio, who's this really,
Mm.
really great illustrator and is brilliant.
Yep.
Friend of mine from San Antonio. He and I talk about it all the time. We talk about, you know, Black culture in America and how one of the things that the Black community has been able to do, and to some extent, their work continues to get co-opted again and again and again by the white mainstream. But over and over again, they've been able to create cultural artifacts and trends that the rest of American society sees as just wow, incredible and motivating and compelling, and that's what we want to see the Latinx community doing more of, is creating that kind of content that will center our identities and resonate for us, but also will make other people look at us and go, damn, those people are really cool and interesting, and their culture is so much, you know, more compelling than I could have ever imagined. They're not just so much of gardeners and housekeepers and gangsters, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
that's work that requires this sort of thing as well, because people love, you know, people consume dark entertainment so much, monster stories, you know, things about magic and fantasy and so forth, in the United States like they never have in the past. And it's the perfect inroad into like greater representation and greater appreciation for people who are not Latinx.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We want our Wakanda, right?
Absolutely, man.
Speaking of which, you also, I mean, you work across all sorts of, you know, modes, storytelling modes, age groups, etc. But the Latinx speculative, you know, I think is really like amazing, and you're really carving out that and making that an experiential space for us. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, you know, it goes hand in hand with, or as a natural evolution, I guess I should say, of what I was doing with border legends and folklore. One of the things that happened to me when I was, I guess, a freshman in college, I was 19. It was the second semester. I took an intro to folklore class, and in that class, I was shocked by the fact that we could study the folk tales of the borderlands in this like intellectual academic way, but also the professor Mark Glazer, with whom later I became really good friends, brought in pre-Columbian Mesoamerican mythology, and it was the first time, frankly, that I had heard of gods like Quetzalcoatl and Tezcatlipoca, Tlaloc, and you know,
Mm,
all of these, just like this rich pantheon. And I was really into friggin' mythology when I was a kid, man. I loved the Greek and Roman gods, the Egyptian gods and Norse
mhm,
gods. And I went to school in McAllen, Texas, which is just a few scant miles from the border. Mexican American, like nearly every kid in the class was Mexican American. Lots of our teachers were Mexican American, and like nobody was ever talking about any of this because it had been erased, not just here in the United States, but it had been erased from my ancestors in Mexico as well. Like it's been hundreds of years
mm,
since that was centered in our lives. So that, like, digging into I guess our the sacred stories of our ancestors, the collective heritage of people who are Mexican or Mexican American, these Mayan and
mhm,
Aztec myths, particularly, I think was just really fruitful in creating fantasy and other types of speculative fiction, like rooting it in that aesthetic and that worldview. And I was helped by the fact that I just kind of got so, over the years, got so interested and obsessed with pre-Columbian Mexico that I began to study Nahuatl, the
mm,
language that is spoken in various variants today by 1.5 million people, but that was the language spoken at the time of the conquest in Tenochtitlan. And then being able to read the documents written in Nahuatl right after the conquest in the original language, and have all that kind of flavor and texture inform the work that I'm doing speculatively, and leading me to do things like, alternate history short stories, like the one called Flower War and Chupacabra Vengeance, about an alternate space race in the 60s, where it's the Soviet Union against the empire of Semanahuac, the Aztec Empire. There's just such a richness and unexplored and completely untapped. I mean, you think about all of the hundreds and thousands of books that have been written that center like European magical systems and like traditional golden age science fictional ways of looking at futurism, and how much richer all those things can be if they're anchored in like indigeneity and ancestral past.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, so much. We have so much. It's like, I don't think you and I to collectively, or even a kind of army of Latinx writers, could possibly, bring to life this richness of our sort of ancestral mythologies, stories,
Yeah.
our speculative spaces that already exist, right?
Yeah, Daniel Jose Older and I were talking one time, and I was like, dude, because we're talking about being prolific and about how some people like kind of like look askance at you, like, oh my god, like stop, what are you doing? But and he was like, dude, we could write 5 books a year for the rest of our lives and still not even make a dent in the gap that exists. So like nobody should be giving any Latinx writers or any writers from communities of color in the US any kind of shit about like being productive, because it's necessary. And and I do it for different audiences, so it's not like I'm like glutting the middle grade market with like 5 or 6 different series. I've got my one middle grade series that we've got on display here, Goddess of Twins, which is about these 2 shape-shifting kids in middle school, and then in the final books they'll be in high school, who they discover they're nahuales, they're shapeshifters, and they have to use those powers to fight against the forces of chaos, because in Mesoamerican thought, the struggle is not between good and evil; it's between order and chaos. And chaos wants to see this world, this 5th sun, right, at Quinto Sol, come to an end, so we can try once more. The gods are like the gods of chaos are like, yeah, humans, they pretty much suck. Let's start over. And so it's about like, how long can we put that off? It's inevitable in Mesoamerican thought, but perhaps it doesn't have to happen right away. And so trying to take that notion and make it palatable to middle school readers, to make it full of adventure and humor and pathos, is a challenge, but it's like a really great one. And like those books, the first one, the Smoking Mirror, was rejected by a couple of dozen agents, and like every single publishing house that accepted unagented manuscripts that I sent it to, until finally it got published with an Australian imprint, an Australian publisher that was trying to create an imprint in the U.S. And it went on to become a Purva Prey author honor and do really, really well, and it sold tens of thousands of copies.
Wow.
So it's you have to like have a vision and have like las ganas, y los huevos. They're like just to keep going, because people will push back against you again and again. Oh, there's so much Spanish in here. I'm like, no, there's not. All these Aztec gods' names are so hard, not any harder than Aphrodite. You've just been saying it your entire life. Right. Aphrodite, Quetzalcoatl, they're not that much harder to say. Just practice, bro. Practice.
Yeah, I love it. Poetry. Oh man, and this is going to kind of weave us into a later question about comics, but yeah, I mean, you're also reaching communities, different communities, through your poetry, and of course, they call me Güero, is another award-winning book. But tell us a little bit about why poetry.
Well, I hinted at it at the very beginning that when I was in 8th grade, had a great teacher in McAllen who introduced me to the power of poetry. Up to that point, I hadn't really taken it seriously, but he showed me that poetry, to quote a line from They Call Me Güero, is the clearest lens for viewing the world. It was a way to kind of like strip away all of the excess baggage of most ways of writing and focus on like just the bare bones essentials to like compress your ideas and your feelings and imagery and so forth into the tightest, richest form possible. And the notion just like blew up in my mind, and I spent like most of high school like writing poetry all the time, just filling notebook after notebook with it. And um, I became like super interested in formal poetry and learning how to write sonnets and haiku and like just playing around with meter and rhythm. All these things were like challenges because they basically force somebody to take the feeling, the notion, the impulse, the moment that they're trying to write about, and fit it within the strictures of a particular form, which feels limiting to a lot of people, but can also be freeing because you're, part of the creative process now becomes the form itself.
Mm.
The form like co-creates the poem with you, and because you have to follow certain rhyme schemes, there are certain words that you can use and other words that you can't, because you have to write a certain number of syllables per line, and the stress and unstressed syllables have to fall in a certain pattern. Those things force you to be creative in ways that just like writing free verse, how whatever words come to mind, which I also do, does not provide. That experience with writing poetry in that formal kind of way um, made it easier for me later on to write to the different forms of the different genres I wanted to write to. And then when I got into like doing screenplays and comic scripts, it gave me the patience to grapple with new strictures and to like find freedom within those boundaries.
Mm.
But one of the other things that I love about poetry is that it also gives me a conduit for bringing ancestral voices into the present. Here we have the cover for Flower Song, Dance, Aztec, and Maya Poetry, which was like my first attempt at publishing poems that I translated from Nahuatl and from Yucatec Maya. And the process of translating it, of like reading closely and listening to ancestral songs as they've come down to us, just the words, we don't have the music obviously, and letting those textures and those rhythms and those peculiarities of construction like influence the way I write poems in Spanish and English, I think like enriched it and allowed me to take those sensibilities, fold them into the writing I was doing, and create original poetry for adults and for young people that would contain echoes of that. I mean, I'm not writing poetry that's like that mirrors it in any sense of the word, but certainly that echoes it.
Yeah, I love that form at a certain moment when you kind of burst through and form becomes a co-creative, formal, central ingredient in what you finally deliver to the world. Yeah, really amazing thing, that beautifully articulated. So let's talk about, you mentioned earlier, kind of the struggle with your Garza twins, and then it finally becoming this runaway success. Your recent projects are definitely with bigger presses, and what was the sort of deciding, how did you decide to go into these, and how did you kind of find that place to bring your story world building with all of these rich ingredients that you bring to bear?
I think that's a really, really important question, and one that I think bears like a longer answer than you may have anticipated. But here we go. So I think, and I've had conversations with people about this who feel that the lack of representation of the intransigence of like the big five publishers basically means that we should just like pick up and move on, that we should create our own spaces for Latinx writers, create our own publishing houses, our own distribution models, and so forth. And while I have nothing against that, I created a small press that is now run by Edward Vidal and McAllen called Flower Song Press. But again and again, I tell people we cannot just leave all that power and money in the hands of the people that have it right now. We have to demand a place at the table, a seat at the table. We have to demand a space for our voices. And the way I broke in was by doing the work, by always being focused on how to take whatever success each one of my projects had and elevate it, leverage it into greater exposure, more opportunities, so that I went from like small little indie presses to university presses to some of the bigger indie presses like Cinco Puntos and Lee and Low, and just to gradually leverage that into greater recognition. It meant building a social media platform. It meant giving out tons of free copies of my books at different library association conferences to get the books in the right hands. That's how Garza Twins finally ended up, the first book, The Smoking Mirror, in the hands of somebody who was on the Puro del Pre committee, because I gave out 100 copies when the first book came out at the Texas Library Association conference back in 2015. There's a lot of work and networking that goes into when you're just starting and there's no easy way in and you keep getting rejected by agent after agent. You have to make your own way. You have to blaze your own trail, and you have to have, again, los huevos y las ganas to like just push. What eventually happened was, I achieved a modicum of success as like this indie Mexican American writer who had won a couple of important awards, and I had networked and knew a lot of people and been promoting and amplifying people's voices. I was a book reviewer for 5 years and reviewed a bunch of Mexican American Latinx authors' books for the big paper down here in the Rio Grande Valley, the McAllen Monitor. So that when the opportunity came along, this is essentially what happened. So Adam Gidwitz, New York Times bestselling author, who had written like a bunch of cool books based on the Grimm fairy tales, and had done like a Star Wars book, and he was looking to take the platform he had created and the privilege and power that he had as an author in New York City, plugged into Penguin Random House's Dutton imprint, and use it to create like a new project that would amplify other people's voices as well. So he created the Unicorn Rescue Society. He wanted to find authors from communities of color to co-author those different books with them. It's basically mythical creatures. And he was sitting down one day with Matt de la Peña, award-winning children's author of YA novels and so forth, and talking about, look, I have a lot of fans in Laredo, Texas. I want to write a book set on the border. I want it to have a chupacabras in it. Who should I reach out to? And Matt said, you need to talk to David Bowles, because it's like that is so much in his sweet spot that it's not even funny. And Matt and I had presented together at several things, and I had just always been supportive of him, and he'd always been so, giving and kind to me, which is something that you see in the Latinx writing community. Like everybody, there's like a cohesiveness and a support for one another that is just amazing. And I see it also with the community of Black authors and the larger community of authors from communities of color. And that's how, Adam contacted me. Matt gave him my contact information, contacted me, asked me whether I'd be interested in being a part of it, and I did. And so that was my first book with one of the big 5 publishers, co-authored with Adam. And based on that book coming out and the good reviews it was getting, HarperCollins reached out to my agent and said, like, hey, you know what, we're getting ready to launch a chapter book line. Now, chapter books are these books for kids ages 5 to 9. It's an interesting spot because these are kids they've moved away from picture books. They've gotten out of early readers. They're not quite ready for middle grade books, but they need something like a little more substantial. And chapter books are these 100-page books, highly illustrated, about 5,000 words. And Scholastic has dominated that. Like their branches line has been putting out those books for like more than a decade. HarperCollins was looking to get into that business, into that field, and they're going to launch a line called Harper Chapters. So they reached out to my agent and asked whether I would be interested in it. Now they have an IP for for our readers who are our listeners, not readers. I'm so used to saying readers. To our listeners who are unaware, an IP is intellectual property, and when we talk about it in when we talk about a publisher's IP, it's an idea they've come up with that they hire an author to write to. So that basic IP, three kids who get trapped in this other world called 13th Street where there are monsters. And I was like, oh yeah, that I can do something with that. And I essentially like transformed it into like this Latinx Stranger Things with that's, populated with all kinds of creatures that Latinx readers are going to immediately get what I'm doing, and connecting the story of 13th Street with ancestral stories of the underworld and things like that. And they were just so excited about the direction I took it in that originally we were going to go with 4 books. It was expanded to 6, and they were super supportive every step of the way of just bringing this vision. And we're talking about books for kids ages 5 to 9. And they let me use Spanish in them, But there are going to be readers who don't speak Spanish, and they allowed me to put Spanish words in the books. I mean, it was just a really, really a wonderful opportunity. And I think that the first 3 books just came out. I think people are going to be super excited to read them. And with along those lines, that kind of opportunity for writing for that group in a heavily illustrated book. I just love illustrations. So many of my books, especially like the early ones that retold folktales, all of them I did in conjunction with an illustrator. Like, and so every single story would have an illustration. I've been wanting to break in to graphic novels and comics for the longest time. I mean, like I told you, since I was a little kid, I've been reading comics and historietas and graphic novels, and it's just like a dream of mine to break into that. And Cinco Puntos, after the success of my book Feathered Serpent, Dark Hearted Sky, which retells all these Aztec and Mayan myths, they were like, okay, this is great for like teens and adults, but we would have loved so much to be able to tell these stories for a younger audience. How would you feel about doing graphic novel adaptations of like 10 key myths and legends?
Yeah.
And I was like, well, at that point, I was doing the HarperCollins thing. I was in the middle of writing a children's book, which has since sold to Penguin Random House. And I was just like, I just had so much on my plate. I always do, Faye. I'm like, it's insane. My wife was like, man, I don't know how you even keep track of what you're doing. And I'm like, because it's all I do. I was really reluctant, but I said, okay, look, we'll do it. But here's the deal. I want you to consider, as illustrator for the first book, because the idea is to have a different illustrator for every book, my daughter. She had just graduated with her bachelor's in fine arts. She's an aspiring graphic novelist. She was the one who did the covers for the Garza Twin series. And they were like, oh yeah, can we take a look at some of her work? She showed them her portfolio. They loved it. And she ended up being the illustrator for the first Tales of the Feathered Serpent, The Rise of the Halfling King. It did an incredible job. It was so much fun. You hardly ever get to work with your daughter. Can you imagine like telling DC, hey, DC, I have this great idea, but I want my daughter. They're like, no, nepotism, no, buddy. And most big publishers also, they're like, no, we've got somebody in mind. It's fine.
Of course. Yeah.
Don't recommend your daughter. What the hell is wrong with you? But Cinco Puntos was like really down for it, and she's done an incredible job. And so I'm really excited.
It's amazing. It's beautiful. And of course, we're going to talk about this project with Raul.
Yeah.
Before we jump in there to talk about that co-creative process, which is also, like you said, very unique to be able to kind of choose your co-creator in this space. But excuse me, comic script, writing novels, illustrated books, poetry, like it's a different onda. It's a different kind of animal. So maybe you can share a couple of insights, and then we can talk about the actual comic that you're co-creating right now.
Yeah, to me, like the biggest challenge, I mean, even because I've written like screenplays. When you're writing a screenplay, even writing a screenplay, you can describe the action that the actors are carrying out, like in real time. They are able to like move. When you're one of the biggest hurdles for somebody who's moving from writing novels to writing comic scripts is that each panel is a frozen moment, and you've got to find the best way to convey action without ever there being any action, because it's just all snapshots, and it's like the weirdest thing ever. Whereas in a novel you can be, Fulano walked across the room slowly until he, reached the light switch with a casual motion. He flipped. You can't do any of that in a comic. You like literally the lights are on, and I mean, you could like have panel after panel of him like moving slowly across the room, but for the most part, unless there's some really important visual reason to show that, you're just going to have panel with the light on, then the next panel he's across the room already flipping the light off, and the next panel it's dark. And understanding that is so crucial. The other thing is, like, you can't really be inside characters' minds. You can't spend a lot of time with like this third person narrator explaining things, because you can have captions and panels, but panels can really only have about 24 words, depending on the size of the panel. And you're basically writing it wrong if you spend all your time filling a panel with a bunch of words. That was one of the hardest things for me to learn. Raul was like really, really key, and we'll talk about it in a little while, and like teaching me how to pull back from my overly wordy that temptation to be overly wordy. Just trusting the visuals more, trusting your co-creator, the illustrator, to convey the emotions that you want to dictate. Learning how to write the script so that my first script for Clockwork Curandera was like way too detailed about specifically what I wanted Raul to do, and we had to have conversations where he's like, "Dude, you're killing me! Like, you've got to give me more freedom here. I mean, we've talked these things through." And then it was basically me. I had to tell, like, "Look, trust me, that's just the way I'm writing. I'm overdoing it, but you don't." You don't have to follow those things as strictly. It's just like, for my own purposes, I need to like panel it out, and like I just can't tell the story unless I'm seeing that. And since we're working, he's off and close to Boston, and I'm down here in South Texas, where he ought to be in El Paso. It's just tougher to do that kind of stuff where you can't just like sit down and talk it out. But yeah, I mean, all those, like, it's like learning a new language. But as I said, the strictures of poetry and other things made it easier for me to accept that and just like go with it, and like not get all petulant about it. Well, but my words are so precious and important, they need to come. No, screw that. Just here's like the number one rule. And if there's something that I could get through all authors' heads, it would be this: you don't matter. The story matters. Like, the story you're trying to tell, that's what matters. And everybody who's working, your agent, your editors, the line editors, your co-creator, if you're doing some graphica, all those people are working with you to make the story the best it can be, and for you to see them as your opponents, for you to see the structure as a barrier rather than as something that can lift and elevate your ideas, it is to get it all wrong. It's not about you. You've got to remove ego from the equation altogether. And I think growing up in a communal space, like a lot of communities of color tend to be, it was a little bit easier for me to do that. I had long ago like tried to remove like self and like just be a conduit for story.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Beautiful. And it resonates so much and so loud with me and my process as well. Clockwork Curandera, if we were to start kind of unpacking this a little bit, for our viewers, even our listeners, could you just kind of start with this first page and tell us your process, and we can move through a couple more of these pages?
Absolutely. I think it's really important to note that when you're starting a graphic novel, it's like you're cold open. You don't have the luxury, again, unless there are some people who can get away with this kind of stuff, but for the most part, you should not be flooding those first pages with a lot of text giving exposition, background, whatever. You need to establish the world efficiently in a few panels, and like establish the characters, the world, like people feel immediately where they are. And so on this very first page, I wanted to be clear that we're dealing with the 19th century. It's clearly the 1800s, from the buildings, the locomotive that's coming, the style of dress of the people. and I mean, there's also like a little caption that says the date too. But I wanted it like just to visually for you to be able to look at it and see that's it. So we're on the depot. We see the main character centered there, Cristina Franco, and then we see the train approach. But there's some essential things that we need to know about Cristina. She is an apprentice curandera. She's able to manipulate what's called green magic, which is for healing and for helping plants grow and stuff like that. So in order to like very quickly set that up and set her up as somebody who is caring and powerful, I came up with the idea of there being like a flower growing up through the slats in the platform of the train platform, and the flower, because people have been stepping on it or whatever, is kind of like wilted and bent over, and for her to then use an indigenous spell, an indigenous phrase to channel green magic into it and make it grow, which is what we see on the next page. If you flip to to the next page, you could see that the Huahuitecan spell that she's used has made the flower blossom, and the magic blows her rebozo back. And you could see that this is no light thing. Taking something that's close to death and bringing it back to life requires a lot of power, and it has consequences, which is kind of a theme throughout the entire book. Because spoiler alert, it's not a big spoiler because it's going to happen in the next couple of pages. Christina's going to be killed, and she's going to be brought back to life. We see then she's now holding the flower in her hand, which is kind of ironic. She's made this thing grow, and now she's plucked it. In the script, I indicate that it's because she's planning on giving it to her brother, who's arriving on the train. But that wouldn't be clear right here. But it does create this kind of like strange tension. And then we see the Zeppelin. So there's a Zeppelin in the air, and this is 1865, before there were Zeppelins. So a reader who's familiar with these different types of genres will now understand that they're in a steampunk graphic novel. Okay, coming out of the Zeppelin are these winged creatures that have kind of like owl features, which will immediately make a good number of Latino, especially Mexican American readers, go, "Oh my God, lechuzas!" And that's exactly what is confirmed. So, we create the central mystery. There are a group of lechuzas coming out of a Zeppelin, heading towards this locomotive. What is going on? It's really weird.
It's awesome. Yeah. The setting, the character kind of establishment, and then the conflict all in like 2 pages.
2 pages. Yeah. I mean, and that's what's so awesome about Graphica is it's so economical. Like a prose writer might take, an entire like introduction or chapter to establish all these things, and it's just not as efficient. Like visuals, just boom, 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 spell it out for the reader right away. And then on the next slide, you could see that these things coming out definitely do have a bad intent. You can see the lechuza is clearly coded as like evil and bad. And I mean, Raul's design for the lechuzas and this like, because they can be fully owl or they can be kind of like were owl, like owl humanoid kinds of things. It's just amazing. And then you can see they attack the train, and she calls her brother's name out. We still don't know at this point that it's her brother. And she's no, Enrique. And she runs into action. She throws herself at this attacking horde of clearly powerful, scary creatures. They're like ripping the door off of the train. So that says something about her. We've already seen that she's powerful, that she can, resuscitate a flower. But now she, runs up onto the top of the train, and she pulls her rebozo off, and she begins to tie it into a knot, and to say, and again, let me see, does it start? Yeah, okay. She says she's going to say the 12 truths, the 12 verdades, and again, like Catholic Mexican or Mexican American, a lot of us will have heard the 12 verdades, which is, like a series of things you say to ward off evil. And she's using it to, tying a knot in her, because normally you tie a knot in a string and you say the 12 verdades to, like, espantar la maldad, to push away bad things. and here she's doing it with the rebozo. It's just visually just really awesome. It gives this like cape-like rebozo like multiple magical uses, and tells you something about her character. She cares about the weak, the broken, defending people who are being attacked. You learn just so much about her character just from those pages, just from her actions, and not anybody like pedantically explaining to you that she's a good person or whatever. It's just it's the ultimate in show don't tell, right?
Yeah.
That's what graphic novels are so awesome about.
And brilliant. I mean, the dynamism, the movement, the energy, all in the kind of paneling and, this very carefully selected, text that you use in its placement. And I can't wait for it. So speaking of which, what is next, Dave?
Yeah. The fourth book of 13th Street is coming out this fall. I also have the Spanish translation of they call me Güero, Me Dicen Güero, which I translated. It's coming out from Penguin Random House's Vintage Español.
Wow.
They're also putting out the Spanish version of Rise of the Halfling King, which will be called El Ascenso del Rey Enano, which I also translated. And then in next year, I've got the first volume, because one of the things that Raul just wanted to pull his unruly hair out about. He's got great hair.
I love his hair. Yeah, I wish I had Raul's hair.
Just boom! It's just like there, right? The one thing that made him want to pull his unruly hair out was just like how long it was, and just how challenging it was going to be to get out. So what we ended up doing was dividing it into 3 volumes. So the first volume is going to be coming out in the early spring. The first volume, this is Clockwork Curandera Volume 1, The Witch Owl Parliament. The story is really complex, and there's a lot of magic and mystery and like politics, and it kind of echoes some of the concerns of our own time. And then I've got my children's book coming out next year as well, called My Two Border Towns, which was picked up by Penguin Random House's Coquila imprint in I think it was a 5-way auction. And I'm super excited about Erika Mesa is doing the illustrations for that, and holy crap, they're so good. And it's about a little boy who lives in a border town and crosses with his dad to visit his cousins and uncles and aunts in Mexico, but also to interact with his friends who are refugees waiting to try to get into the United States and living in little camps at the border. So it's a really, I think, powerful and timely story that I'm super excited to see. That's coming out next summer. And then right now I'm writing this massive, oh my God, project with Guadalupe Garcia McCall, which it's called The Moon Conch. We'll probably be done this summer, and we're hoping that our agents can get it sold pretty quick. It is a YA romance novel that takes place across 500 years. It's the 2 intersecting stories of a 17-year-old Mexica boy who's caught in Tenochtitlan during the siege in 1521, right before the city completely collapses and is conquered, and a 17-year-old Mexican girl from Veracruz in 2019 who is trying to get to her father in the United States and gets picked up by ICE and goes through all these things. So it's these 2 stories, and they're connected by this sacred conch that was used in rituals for the moon goddess Coyolxauhqui. And across the centuries, they fall in love and help each other and try to find a way to be together. So it's a really, really powerful story that talks about a moment that hardly anybody has ever written about in a fictional book, and that is the 4-month siege of Tenochtitlan right before it fell, and the eventual basic destruction of Mexica civilization as it was at the time. So next year is the 500th anniversary of that. So it's a super timely book and super.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, so that
so
book
amazing.
I'm super excited about it, and we're halfway through, so we're super excited about it.
I am so excited about everything, David. I can't wait I can't wait for it all. And thank you. I'll have to mainline, David, in this coming year with all the stuff that you've got coming out. David Bowles, incredible conversation. Thank you for gifting us and me your time, your insight, your talent, your everything. I just want to say thank you, David.
Thank you. Gracias. Tlazokamati.